I had just finished stacking firewood near the porch of my lake cabin when I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. It was unusual because I was not expecting anyone that day. The air was calm, the lake shimmered under the late afternoon sun, and the peace I came here for felt unshakable until that moment. When I turned, I saw Karen from the HOA storming up the path, her arms swinging with dramatic purpose. Her eyes darted around as if she owned the place, and I already knew this would not be good. She had made it her mission to police everyone in the community even though she had no actual authority. She barged right onto the porch without knocking and shouted that I was not supposed to be there. I stood still trying to process what she had just said. She claimed this was community property and that my presence here was nothing short of trespassing. I told her calmly that this cabin had been in my family for years, long before the HOA was even formed, and that I had every right to be here. But she refused to listen. Instead, she pulled out her phone and with a loud voice dialed the cops, claiming that a squatter had taken over a cabin on the lake. I could not believe what I was hearing. She marched around my living room, peeking into corners, taking pictures of my furniture, my photos, even my father's old fishing gear. I told her to stop, but she just smirked and said evidence was needed for her report. The nerve of this woman left me speechless. Soon enough, a sheriff vehicle pulled up outside the cabin. Karen ran out to greet them, waving her hands frantically, like she had just uncovered a major crime. She started explaining in her usual dramatic way about how a dangerous trespasser was living in this cabin and how she bravely reported it to protect the community. I watched the sheriff step out, calm and serious, listening to her every word while she gestured toward me with accusing eyes. When the sheriff finally turned to me, I handed him my identification and property deed copies I always kept at the cabin for situations just like this. He took a careful look and nodded without hesitation. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she had swallowed something sour. The sheriff then asked her a simple question: did she have any proof that the cabin belonged to the HOA or to her in any way? She stammered, tripped over her words, and pointed vaguely toward the HOA bylaws she always carried in a folder. The sheriff glanced at the folder briefly, then shook his head slowly. He explained to her that property deeds filed with the county outweighed any neighborhood guidelines or HOA complaints. At that moment, Karen went pale, her confidence draining from her face as quickly as it had arrived. But she still tried to argue. She raised her voice, claiming that the HOA rules gave her authority to enter and inspect any property on the lake. The sheriff interrupted firmly, saying that entering without permission was trespassing and could even be considered breaking and entering. Suddenly, the power in her voice cracked like thin glass. She stepped back, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to find a way out of the hole she had dug for herself. Karen froze on the porch, her face turning red as the sheriff's words sank in. She looked at me, then at the sheriff, then back at the ground, as if trying to come up with a new excuse. But her usual sharp tongue seemed stuck, and for the first time I saw hesitation in her. The sheriff crossed his arms and repeated himself. Trespassing was a serious matter, and if she had entered my cabin without my permission, that was something I could report. I stepped closer, keeping my voice calm but firm. I told Karen that she had no right to barge into my home, no matter what she thought of me or the HOA. Her hands shook slightly as she tried to argue that she was only protecting the community, but the sheriff cut her off again, saying that what she had done was not protecting anyone, it was harassment. The silence that followed was heavy, only broken by the sound of the lake water brushing against the shore. The sheriff asked me if I wanted to press charges, and Karen gasped loudly, her voice cracking as she begged him not to say such a thing. She glanced at me, her eyes wide, desperate, but I stayed quiet, letting her feel the weight of her own actions. The sheriff told her she needed to leave the property immediately and not return unless she was invited. Her mouth opened as if she wanted to fight back, but she saw the firm look on his face and finally lowered her head. She muttered something under her breath and turned on her heel, stomping back toward the gravel path, her footsteps crunching in angry rhythm. The sheriff watched her go, then turned back to me, his expression softening. He said he had seen plenty of cases like this where someone from an HOA took things too far and tried to act like the law when they were not. I nodded and thanked him for stepping in, because without him the situation could have spiraled even worse. He reminded me to keep all my documents safe and said if Karen tried anything again I should call the sheriff's office immediately. After he left, the air finally felt calm again, but I knew Karen was not the type to simply let things go. I stood on the porch watching the sun dip lower over the lake, wondering what her next move would be and how far she would go to try to control something that was never hers to begin with. The next morning, I woke to the sound of voices outside my cabin. Peeking through the window, I saw Karen standing at the edge of my property with two other HOA board members. She was waving papers in her hands, her voice sharp even from a distance. I stepped onto the porch and called out, asking what she thought she was doing now. Karen lifted the papers like they were a weapon, claiming she had found proof that my cabin violated multiple HOA rules. The two board members looked uncomfortable. One of them shifted his weight, avoiding my eyes. The other just stared at the ground. I told Karen again that my cabin was grandfathered in and legally registered with the county. She snapped back, saying that rules were rules and the HOA had the authority to enforce them. Before I could answer, a pickup truck pulled up along the road. It was my neighbor Frank, a retired contractor who had lived by the lake longer than anyone. He stepped out slowly, adjusting his cap, and walked toward us, asking what all the fuss was about. When Karen tried to explain, Frank cut her off, his voice steady. He told her that he had been here when my grandfather built the cabin, and he knew for a fact it was not under the HOA jurisdiction. Karen flushed bright red, insisting that was irrelevant, but Frank stood tall and firm, telling her she was wasting her time. The board members looked even more uneasy. One of them finally muttered that maybe they should review the situation before taking further action. Karen glared at him, her jaw tight, but she did not argue back. Instead, she turned toward me, her eyes narrowing like she was already planning her next move. Frank leaned closer to me and whispered that Karen had a history of pushing people too far, and if I needed backup, the community would stand with me. I thanked him and watched as Karen stormed off, the papers still clutched in her hand. But deep down, I knew she would not stop there. Her pride was too strong, and she would find another way to try to make my life difficult. Later that afternoon, I decided to take a walk down to the lake to clear my head. The water was calm, and the sunlight reflected off the ripples like glass. It was the kind of peace I had always wanted when I chose to stay at the cabin. But as I reached the shore, I noticed Karen standing near the dock, her arms crossed and her phone pressed tightly to her ear. I could hear snippets of her voice. She was telling someone that I was refusing to comply with HOA rules and that I was a threat to the neighborhood. When she saw me, she quickly hung up and tried to act like she had just been enjoying the lake, but her smug expression gave her away. I asked her directly who she had been talking to. She refused to answer, just saying I would find out soon enough. As I stood there, Frank appeared again, walking down the trail with his fishing pole. He waved and gave me a look like he already knew Karen was up to something. Karen straightened her posture and pointed at the fire pit near the edge of my cabin. She said it was illegal, unsafe, and an eyesore, and that she had reported it to the county fire department. Before I could even react, Frank let out a laugh, shaking his head. He said he had built that fire pit himself years ago using the proper clearances and stone approved by the county. Karen froze for a moment, then snapped that she did not care what Frank said. The fire chief would decide, and she was certain it would be torn down. Almost as if on cue, a red truck pulled up near the dirt road, and the county fire chief stepped out, adjusting his badge as he approached us. Karen immediately ran to him, her voice rising as she explained her version of events. But the chief held up a hand and said he wanted to inspect things for himself, so we all walked back toward the cabin with Karen trailing just behind him, her eyes flashing with anticipation. My heart pounded as the chief examined the fire pit, measuring the distance from the cabin, checking the stonework, and even looking at the permit paper I handed him. When he finally straightened up, he nodded firmly and said the fire pit was fully compliant, safe, and built to code. Frank grinned at me and slapped my shoulder while Karen stood stiff, her mouth opening and closing like she could not believe what she had just heard. Her face turned pale as the chief added that wasting official resources with false reports could result in penalties. Karen did not say a word. She just clutched her phone tighter and slowly backed away, her earlier confidence completely drained. The chief looked at me once more and told me to keep up the good work maintaining the property. He reminded me that the cabin was an asset to the community, not a threat. Frank gave a nod of agreement and said that neighbors should be looking out for one another, not stirring up trouble. Karen, however, stood frozen, her jaw tight, her breathing uneven. It was clear she was furious, but she did not dare argue against the fire chief. As he walked back to his truck, she suddenly blurted out that she was going to bring this to the HOA board and that they would make sure I faced consequences. Frank chuckled, shaking his head. He told her the board had no power over county law and she was wasting her time. Still, Karen stormed off, muttering to herself. As she marched toward her car, she slammed the door shut and drove off down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust behind her. When the dust settled, Frank turned to me with a grin and said, "That woman will never quit. She will keep trying until she embarrasses herself in front of the entire town." I sighed, realizing he was probably right, but deep down I knew her obsession with control was only digging her a deeper hole. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the trees, I sat by the fire pit with Frank, the warm glow of the flames lighting up the night sky. We roasted a few marshmallows and talked about the old days when the lake was quiet and no one had to worry about power-hungry neighbors. Frank told me he had seen people like Karen before, and they always pushed too far until they ended up being the ones everyone turned against. As the fire crackled, I thought about his words and realized this was far from over. Karen would be back with another scheme. And I would have to be ready when she did. The next morning I woke up early to the sound of birds and the gentle waves lapping at the lake shore. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee in hand, breathing in the crisp air. The cabin always gave me peace, but lately with Karen stirring trouble it felt like peace came in small doses. As I sat on the porch, I noticed a figure walking down the path. It was Frank, carrying his fishing gear. He waved and said he wanted to hit the lake before the sun got too high. He also mentioned he heard some chatter in town that Karen was telling anyone who would listen that I was a menace to the community. I laughed and asked what exactly she thought I had done wrong this time. Frank shrugged and said apparently she claimed the smoke from my fire pit was toxic and that it could poison the air around the lake. We both laughed at the absurdity of it, but deep down I knew she was not going to stop until she got the attention she craved. Around midday, I saw Karen's car pull up at the end of the dirt road. She stepped out dressed far too formally for a lakeside visit and marched toward the cabin with a clipboard in her hand. Her face was pinched tight, and she announced that she had called for another inspection, this time from the county environmental officer. Frank raised his eyebrows and muttered under his breath, "Here we go again." Karen began scribbling notes on her clipboard as if she were documenting some grand violation. She claimed the smoke from the fire pit was hazardous and could cause health issues for anyone nearby. I calmly reminded her that the fire pit had already been approved and inspected, but she brushed me off, saying this time she had evidence. Frank leaned against a tree, arms crossed, enjoying the show. He whispered to me that she was digging her own grave with all these false claims. Soon enough, a county vehicle pulled up and an officer stepped out with a friendly smile. He introduced himself and asked what the concern was. Karen rushed forward, waving her clipboard, dramatically pointing to the fire pit and insisting that it was a danger to everyone living near the lake. The officer listened patiently, then walked over to examine the fire pit. He took notes, measured the distance from the cabin and the trees, and even checked the fire safety equipment I kept nearby. After a few minutes, he turned to me and said everything looks perfectly safe and compliant. He even complimented the setup, saying it was one of the best maintained fire pits he had seen in the area. Karen went pale, her mouth opened, but no words came out. It was as if her entire plan had collapsed in an instant. Frank chuckled loudly, saying, "Well, Karen, looks like you struck out again." But I knew from the fire in her eyes that she was not finished, not by a long shot. Karen stood frozen for a moment, clutching her clipboard so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The county officer handed me a copy of his notes, assuring me that my fire pit was fully compliant and safe. Then he looked at Karen and said, "Ma'am, you should be careful about filing unnecessary complaints. It wastes resources and time." Karen sputtered something about community safety, but her voice cracked under the weight of the officer's words. Frank grinned and muttered, "Looks like the county is catching on to her games." Karen turned sharply and glared at both of us, her face flushed with anger. She stormed back toward her car, muttering that this was not over. I watched her speed off down the dirt road, leaving a trail of dust behind. The lake returned to silence, but the air still felt heavy, as if her presence lingered. Frank shook his head, saying she is going to come back with something bigger, just wait. He was right. Karen was the type who thrived on drama, and if she failed one way, she would just find another path. Later that evening, I sat by the fire pit roasting marshmallows when I saw headlights approaching slowly. This time it was the sheriff himself, stepping out of his truck with a calm but serious expression. He greeted me politely and said he had received yet another complaint from Karen this time. She had claimed that I was holding unsafe gatherings and causing disturbances late at night. I almost laughed. The absurdity was endless, but I kept a straight face explaining to the sheriff that the only gathering tonight was me, my marshmallows, and the fire pit. The sheriff looked around at the quiet cabin, the peaceful lake, and the calm fire crackling. He chuckled and said, "Well, I figured as much, but protocol requires me to check." Frank, who had stayed nearby during the evening, called out from the porch, "Tell him, Sheriff, we have the most dangerous marshmallows in the county." The sheriff laughed, shaking his head. He wrote a brief note and assured me I was fine before adding that Karen had been warned multiple times about making false reports. He also hinted that if she continued, there could be real consequences for her actions. As the sheriff left, I felt a sense of relief, but also knew Karen would not back down easily. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the lake. The peace of the evening slowly returned, but my mind kept circling back to the same thought. Karen was planning her next move, and it was only a matter of time before she struck again. The following morning, the lake was quiet except for the soft calls of birds overhead. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee, enjoying the cool breeze drifting off the water, when I noticed Karen's car parked near the end of the road. She was sitting inside, scribbling something furiously on her clipboard, her face red with determination. Frank wandered over, holding a fishing rod. He spotted her and groaned. "Here we go again," he said, shaking his head. As if on cue, Karen got out of the car and marched toward us, her heels clicking against the gravel. She held a thick folder in her hand. "This property is out of compliance," she announced loudly as though she were delivering a speech. She waved the folder in the air. "I have documentation right here, and I will make sure the county reviews it." I calmly asked her what exactly she was referring to this time. She flipped through her papers dramatically, then pointed toward my dock, claiming it was a hazard to the community and must be removed immediately. Frank laughed so hard he nearly dropped his fishing rod. "The dock is older than you being a nuisance, Karen," he said between chuckles. Karen turned redder than before, her lips pressed into a thin line. She raised her voice, insisting she would not stop until my entire property was brought into compliance. At that moment, another vehicle pulled up. It was the county inspector himself, the same one who had cleared my fire pit the day before. He stepped out with a clipboard and walked over, greeting me politely, then turning to Karen with a weary sigh. "What is it this time, ma'am?" he asked. Karen immediately began her tirade, pointing at the dock, the cabin, and even the firewood stacked neatly by the side of the porch. She rattled off her list of supposed violations. The inspector looked around, calmly jotting down notes before turning to me with a faint smile. "Don't worry," he said. "Everything looks perfectly fine, but I do need to document this for the record." Karen gasped in disbelief. She demanded that he look again, insisting that something had to be wrong. The inspector closed his notebook and told her firmly, "Ma'am, this property is compliant. There are no issues here. If these complaints continue, we will have to escalate matters on your end." Her jaw dropped. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She simply stood there, trembling with rage. Frank whispered to me, "Bet she is about to blow a fuse right here." But instead of exploding, Karen spun on her heels, stormed back to her car, and slammed the door so hard it echoed through the quiet lake. The inspector gave me a knowing look before driving away. Frank shook his head once again, saying, "You know, she is cooking up something even crazier now." I nodded, staring at the rippling lake, knowing he was right. Karen was not finished, not by a long shot. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the lake, I sat on the porch trying to relax, but my mind kept drifting back to Karen and her endless schemes. Frank came over carrying 2 folding chairs and set one beside me. He handed me a soda, and we both watched the water in silence for a while. Then he muttered, "She is planning something. I can feel it. She won't let it go, not until she makes a fool of herself again." I sighed, knowing he was right. Karen was too stubborn to give up. Just as the stars began to appear, I noticed a faint light moving through the trees near my cabin. It was a flashlight bobbing up and down. Frank leaned forward, whispering, "Is that who I think it is?" We stayed quiet, watching the light grow closer until finally we could see her silhouette. It was Karen, creeping along the edge of my property, muttering to herself while writing something down in a notebook. She stopped near the dock, shining the flashlight across the wood. Then she crouched low, as if searching for some flaw she could use against me. Frank chuckled softly. "This is unreal. She is trespassing just to invent problems." I pulled out my phone and took a quick picture. The beam of her flashlight caught her face clearly enough to prove what she was doing. Karen froze when she heard the click. She turned her head and spotted us, sitting calmly on the porch, watching her. Her face went pale in the dim light, and she stumbled back, mumbling something before bolting toward the trees, flashlight swinging wildly in her hand. Frank laughed so hard, he nearly tipped over in his chair. She got caught red-handed, he said between breaths. I leaned back, still holding my phone with the evidence, knowing this was only going to get more interesting the next time Karen tried to stir trouble. The next morning, I printed the photo of Karen trespassing and slipped it into a folder along with the deed to my cabin and the letter from the sheriff. By noon, Karen stormed into the HOA office with her usual dramatic flair, accusing me once again of being a squatter and a danger to the community. The sheriff happened to be there speaking with the HOA president when Karen burst in. Before she could finish her rant, I calmly handed the folder to the sheriff. He opened it, looked at the photo of Karen creeping around my dock, and raised his brows. Then he turned to her and said, "Karen, not only is this man the legal owner of his cabin, but you were caught trespassing on his property last night." The room went silent. Karen stammered, trying to explain, but her words came out as nonsense. She glanced around, hoping someone would defend her, but no one moved. The HOA president rubbed his temples, clearly embarrassed, then announced, "Karen, your behavior has gone too far. This will be noted, and disciplinary action will follow." Karen's face turned beet red, her lips quivered, but no sound came out. She finally grabbed her bag and fled the office, her heels clicking furiously down the hall. Frank, who had come along for backup, patted me on the shoulder, grinning. "You just won the war, my friend." From that day on, Karen never so much as set foot near my cabin again. She avoided eye contact every time I passed her in the neighborhood. The lake cabin finally became what I had dreamed it would be, a quiet place of peace, laughter, and friendship. And the legend of the day Karen got outsmarted by her own schemes was something neighbors would whisper about for years to come.